got? Can you hear me? Oh, good. Well, welcome, fellow walkers, bicyclists, and people just interested in Lancaster and the improvement of the lifestyle and the jewel that we have. I have the privilege tonight of introducing Jeff Speck. Jeff wrote Walkable Cities, How Downtown Will Save America, and many of us read that and had a revelation about if you applied this to the city of Lancaster, how much more it would do to improve what already is a great city. I invited Jeff up, I guess it was in August or September, and we had a meeting with him at night. The staff met with him and city council met with him. The next morning there was a breakfast for different community leaders, and by the time we left the breakfast, we all but had confirmed that we had enough funding for Jeff to do a walkability study for the city of Lancaster. The Steinman Foundation, the Ferry Foundation, the Community Foundation, and Lancaster General Hospital, and the city of Lancaster all kicked in after hearing just a little bit of Jeff that morning. Jeff then came up and spoke, I guess it was in November, on the general principles of walkability and what the elements of walkability are, with a little bit of applicability to the city of Lancaster. He then spent a week here, and I drove around with him. It was fun as I double parked in the middle of, say, Walnut Street, and he stepped off Walnut Street and came back and was amazed that it was 34 feet or 42 feet. 42 feet, okay. And how wide the lanes were all over the city, a really in-depth study. In addition, at this time, the Lancaster City Alliance is doing and getting close to finishing its strategic economic development plan, which we put Jeff and the people writing that and working on that together, and they sort of fed off of each other, and hopefully what you'll see tonight will be included to some extent in that strategic economic development plan. So they've coordinated things as they went along. I should mention there's a public meeting on Thursday, March 19th at McCaskey East, where they'll do what Jeff is doing tonight, and that's not present the final plan, but present almost the final plan. Jeff insists that this is not a plan. This is a study that he's doing of Lancaster with various suggestions. I saw an abbreviated version this morning, or excuse me, this afternoon, and you're about to be entertained. Also, Jeff doesn't want me to say this, I'm sure, but he told me he feels this is the best PowerPoint presentation he's ever put together. So I say to the funders, hopefully our money was well spent, and I know it was. So without further ado, Jeff Speck. Jeff?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for your hospitality. I was mentioning to the staff earlier today, you know, all mayors are extroverts or they wouldn't be mayor, or at least they're not mayor for long. But Mayor Rick is the most hospitable. I spent more time with the mayor and with the mayor's wife, I might add, on this study than any I've done before. And maybe that's why this is the longest PowerPoint I've ever made. It's actually not a PowerPoint, it's two PowerPoints because it wouldn't fit on one file. My walkability study for Albuquerque was 470 slides. This is 475. But I go very fast. You will be out of here before the snowstorm, but that's not till tomorrow. So I am going to rush. I'm going to have to stop myself from, there's a lot of asides I want to give and a lot of comments I want to make and a lot of just general impressions I want to share with you that I really don't have time to share with you because there's so much I want to communicate. I'm going to communicate most of what is in the actual report, which will be handed in shortly. Not everything, so you still need to read that. But I do want to go through as much as I can in person tonight so that you understand maybe a little bit better some of the reasoning behind the analysis. Although there's a heck of a lot of reasoning in the report, which is also the longest report I've ever written, at approximately 130 pages, which makes it 30 pages longer than my last longest. So I'm here tonight to do this. I come from Boston, where I moved recently from Washington. I bring you greetings. This could be you tomorrow. It's not all dour. It's fun too, and sometimes you just don't have to worry about how fast the cars are going in Boston. So this was this is what I was here in November. This was the talk I gave you on November 16th, and that was called Towards a More Walkable Lancaster. And tonight, it's really about making a more walkable Lancaster, or as I would say, making Lancaster more walkable. And you know, you guys were born on third base, right? You're in good shape. I think we have to remember that. But in the larger context, it's important to remember that you were very poised to thrive as a city in a beautiful region that's got incredible quality. And you really have to remember that you know, all the statistics, the leading fellow who talks about this, whose brother is in the audience, is Chris Lineberger. And there's a great book called The Option of Urbanism. And Chris comes to Lancaster. You probably heard him speak. And he talks about all the reasons why people are going back to cities, and businesses are going back to cities. Marriott, I'm staying in the Marriott. Marriott just announced they're going to relocate from their suburban headquarters to a city headquarters because that's what their workers want. And of course, tons of people are moving to cities. But they're not moving to any old city. Chris makes it very clear they're moving to walkable urbanism. You know, the choice isn't between city and country. It's between, or I should say city and sprawl. It's between walkable urbanism and drivable suburbanism. And this is what people want. And you're at a real advantage. You are an urban place. You know, I was an art history major. My favorite 20th century artist, coincidentally perhaps, is Charles Demuth. And Demuth was from here, and he came here, and he worked here. You know, my wife's from Iowa. They had Grant Wood. But Demuth is from here. And this is the kind of stuff, looking out the window, you know, of the house next to the cigar shop, it was this dome. This is the sort of stuff you saw here. This is what people want, and it's what you have, in addition to his paintings. So understand that you're starting in a good position, but you have some real strengths. You also have some real weaknesses, which we're going to be talking about. This is my study area, and I ended up going well outside my study area, as you'll see, because I happened to visit certain streets, and I saw that they needed attention. But this happens to correspond with the study area that the economics effort underway is now looking at, which is essentially the heart of the downtown and the key corridors heading into the downtown. So who was here at my last talk? Okay, sorry, who wasn't here at my last talk? All right, it's actually about 50-50. Okay, so this will be a little bit of a review for those of you who were here before, but only in the context of fleshing it out with the actual recommendations that these things lead us to. But what I talked about last time and what I talk about in my book and in all the talks that I give is this assumption that we all start with that didn't used to be a universal assumption, but now wherever I go, people are telling me, yes, we understand that a vital place is full of pedestrians. And so if a vital place is full of pedestrians, the question for city planning becomes, how do you get people to walk? And that leads to what I call my general theory of walkability. It's in the book, which I hope you'll read. And the answer is that in America, in which driving is so easy and cheap, and you don't pay the full cost, and the car is typically sitting between you and everything in the driveway, you know, if you're going to get people to walk instead of drive, or bike for that matter, then the walk or bike has to be at least as good as the drive, if not better. And that means that you have to do four things simultaneously. The walk has to be useful, it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable, and it has to be interesting. So that's my structure of this analysis, and it's the structure of my presentation tonight. For simplicity, and because it turned out this way, the comfortable and interesting walk we're going to combine into one final segment. And then the first two segments, the useful and the safe walk, we're going to reverse, because the safe walk is the biggest challenge here in Lancaster. So this is my talk tonight. The safe walk is something I know you guys have been paying a lot more attention to lately. It's really sad what happened recently with Chuck Lehman, and that was you know, a shock. But then you look at this. You know, this is 5 years, only 5 years of pedestrian automobile conflicts. And someone asked me, is this just car crashes? No, this is pedestrian automobile conflicts, collisions in your downtown. So as beautiful and walkable in certain ways as your downtown is, the safety is the biggest challenge. So what adds up to a safe walk? I'm going to talk to you about safety factors, and then I'm going to take it street by street, suggesting changes for individual streets in my study area and outside. Special attention being paid to the Harrisburg Pike, the foundation for the bike plan that you're about to embark upon, and then Penn Square as a real opportunity. So zooming in again, what are the safety factors? I would say that they're these. First is design speed, which I'll explain. And then design speed, which is the road that the speed that the road implies when you're sitting on it in your car, that it tells you to drive, is made up of all these different things. The number of lanes, the lane width, one-way versus two-way streets, the presence and the length of turn lanes, the geometry of the street, whether it swoops or not, whether the curbs are protected typically by parallel parking or sometimes by trees, and the presence of bike lanes. So again, this will be the structure then of this part of the talk. Oh, and then finally the design of crosswalks. I include the design of crosswalks. I mean, people wouldn't pay me to tell them to put crosswalks in their city. I mean, it's so obvious that I try not to talk about it, but actually there's a few places here where you need to look at it more closely. So that's the hierarchy, or not just the hierarchy, but the list. So now design speed is a very interesting thing because most non-engineers don't know that engineers are taught to design streets for higher speeds than they want to set the speed limits at, with the idea that the higher speed design is a safety buffer. That if you create a wider lane, if you keep the sidewalk clear, if you do all these other things that create fewer opportunities for conflict, you're actually making the streets safer because people will speed. But people forget, or just never thought to realize, that the higher the implied speed of the street, the faster people will go. And so actually you need to look at design speeds that match your desired speed. This is the current revolution now underway in the traffic engineering profession. It's that design speed determines driver speed and therefore must match desired speed. So, this is what we've been doing for so many years, We got to enforce it with airplanes because it's designed for 50 miles an hour. And then you have streets like the Harrisburg Pike, that are highways, but are also city streets with highway width lanes that imply high speeds. And then even downtown, many streets like this part of Queen, notice where the question mark is there, and the marked speed limit, which means nothing, right? It means nothing. What matters is the design of the street. So now, what are the factors that add up to design speed? The first one, of course, is number of lanes. The more lanes your city street has, the more it looks like a highway. The more drivers are encouraged to speed. The further pedestrians have to walk. So clearly, where you have a number of lanes that's well in excess of the number of trips or the number of lanes that the trips on the lanes would require, then there's an opportunity to change that. In Oklahoma City, this was a street that actually had enough trips on it to justify 2 lanes, right? Because trips correspond with lanes. Each lane can handle so many trips. In this case, it was a 6-laner that was handling 2 lanes of traffic. Now it's a 3-laner because we fixed it. But the point is, when you look at a street that's got multiple lanes like this, you then look at the counts. Now we know, engineers tell us, good engineers, bad engineers, they all tell us, that each one-way lane can move between 500 and 800 cars per hour. If you've got a green wave and not too much conflicting traffic, you can do 800 cars per hour. If you've got conflicting traffic, like a tic-tac-toe network like you have, with heavy traffic in every direction at rush hour, then you're looking more at 500 or so trips per lane. So you look at King Street here and you do the counts. We know that 3 lanes will get you 1,500 cars per hour. But then we look at the load, and we see that it's about twice the size it needs to be. And by the way, vehicle miles traveled in America per capita is flat. It's stopped increasing. And what we're finding is that as cities become more urban and more walkable and more mixed use and all the things that are happening here, that the car ownership declines and the trips decline. So we have no reason, as we build more in your down, some people will say, oh, but as we build more, the number of trips will increase. But in fact, as you build more urban, in urban places, the number of trips drops because you make walkability more possible. So here you're looking at a street that's sized at about twice what it needs to be. Let's look at Church Street, right? The superhighway a little south of downtown. And here you have a capacity, again, of 1,500 cars per hour or more. Look at that. That could be one lane. So I'm not going to say make it one lane. I'm going to say make it 2 lane. I like to compromise. But the point is that you look for where capacity is well in excess of demand, and then that's where you can change. Oh, there's a okay, got it. Now, lane width next. We like to joke. Andre Stwani, my mentor, used to say the typical street, the typical subdivision in America is wide enough to allow you to witness the curvature of the earth. That's because the standards have changed. And I showed this last time, a subdivision from the 60s and a subdivision from the 80s. The standards have just changed. Look, the houses are the same size, but the streets are 3 times as wide. And that's just mission creep. Roads are getting wider and wider. And we know that the wider streets get, the faster people go and more people are dying. The traffic engineers generally do not acknowledge this. They've begun to acknowledge it. And we're here to kind of force their hand and say, it's time to act on that acknowledgement. This is about 8 years ago. This is the Institute of Transportation Engineers came out with a standard with 10 to 11 feet in urban areas, kind of about halfway there. The old standard has always been 10 feet. Around the world, other places are narrow, but the American standard has always been 10 feet. And now, it's becoming the standard again here in Montgomery, I should say in Montgomery County near where I used to live. 10 feet is becoming the rule for all streets. And then this is contraband. This is bootleg. This is from a talk that an engineer who's working on the new ITE, Institute of Traffic Engineers, engineering handbook that isn't out yet. He presented this at a meeting, and unless someone kills it, 10 feet should be the default width for all streets where you want 45 miles per hour or less, which of course is the entirety of your downtown. And I'm working in a lot of places where 12 feet is still the standard. So this is super important, and this will hopefully force their hand. So we know this. I just want to be extremely blatant. Forgive me for being pedantic. We know that wider lanes invite higher speeds. We know that higher speeds kill more people. Right? Here's the chart. 44 miles an hour is an 83% chance of death. 31 miles an hour, there's a 37% chance of death. So if we know that higher speeds kill more people, we know that wider lanes kill more people. We know then that narrower lanes save lives. We want to save lives. We want narrower lanes. Okay? It sounds obvious, but there will be people who argue this, so there you go. So the typical street, and this is interesting, the typical street you find, the city-owned streets in Lancaster, such as Mulberry and Charlotte and Lemon and James and Chestnut and Walnut, they hold in 39 to 44 feet what typical American streets hold in 34 to 36 feet. 2 lanes of parking and 2 lanes of driving. It's usually 7, 10, 10, 7 or 8, 10, 10, 8, and you've got 7, 15, 15, 7 or something like that. And it changes from street to street. Here you've got South Duke. Here you've got North Prince, where this is really important. Here, because it's more than 36 feet, it's deemed wide enough to have parallel parking. But here, where it narrows to about 34 feet, which is a classic 7, 10, 10, 7, it's deemed not wide enough for parallel parking. And so you end up with these 13-foot and 14-foot driving lanes, which is why people are speeding down that hill. And then here you have, praise the Lord, Lime Street. For 1 block, 32 feet, roughly, from edge to edge, it's like a 7, 9.5, 9.5, 7. And here it is, 7.5, 9, 9, 7.5, whatever you want to call it. And this is a state DOT. It's yellow on the map. And so it works. People are not dying on this street. In fact, I would argue it's a safer street, and I even took a video. This is rush hour. This is buses, right? Driven by humans on this street. And this is the sort of thing that theoretically is impossible, but that you find all over American cities. And this, God help us that after this talk they're going to remove the parking. But my point is, you bring the officials there and you say, look, this works. You know, 7, 9, 9, 9, 7 works. So 7, 10, 10, 7 should work. And we need to understand that that becomes our standard. Thank you. One-way versus two-way streets. This is the biggest nut to crack in Lancaster. It's the biggest change you see, aside from bicycling, It's the biggest change you see happening all over the country. Cities are changing their one-way systems, which used to be two-way, back to two-way. Why? Because the data is slowly coming in, but we've known for many years that one-way streets are more dangerous, much more intimidating to pedestrians. The sheer volume of traffic all going in the same direction, the absence of opposing traffic that makes the cars slow down, and most importantly, the opportunity to jockey from lane to lane that changes your mindset as a driver from a driver to a racer. Because you know whatever lane you're in, the other lane is faster. And it's a chance to go faster. And your brain chemistry changes when there's that other lane there. Because you can speed, right? So that's super important. And then there's these great stories you hear across the country of places like Vancouver, Washington, famously discussed in Governing Magazine, where converting it finally from a one-way back to a two-way street doubled the amount of revenue to the retailers. And most recent study, this is brand new, this is about 3 months old, from Louisville, Kentucky. They converted Brook, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Street. Well, I'm sorry, they converted Brook and 1st back to two-way, and they kept 2nd and 3rd as one-way. So Brook and 1st reverted to two-way, 2nd and 3rd kept as one-way. Let's look at the two-way streets, Brook and 1st. Car crashes went down almost 50%. Crime went down 23%. Let's look at the streets that were not reverted. Car crashes went up 15%, and crime went up 36%. So there's so little data, but every piece of data we have is this compelling. And then I'm working in Cedar Rapids, where you have a similar condition. You have half one-way streets in the downtown. We're converting it from half one-way to all two-way. And when I got there, they were about to spend $3 million just to rebuild this one street. And I said, you know, we don't have that much money. Why should we rebuild it all when we can restripe? And I showed this slide. Say, don't rebuild, restripe. You can restripe a whole grid for the price of rebuilding one street. And that's going to be my message to you a couple times tonight. That you just do this with paint. You know, turn the one-way, half one-way grid to a two-way grid. So you have that already happening, and God knows I didn't bring this to Lancaster. So you've got Mulberry Street, which is already, and I'm going to be showing you a lot of these, and what you're looking at here is a before and an after. So at the top of the slide, you have the current condition. At the bottom of the slide, you have the future condition. In this case, it's a little bit trickier because I'm actually showing planned and proposed. I made some slight changes that I'll talk to you about in a minute to what you're proposing for Mulberry Street. But the point is that Mulberry is already underway becoming a two-way street. And it's being considered for many others. So here's your current system now. We're presuming that Mulberry is a done deal and Charlotte is going to be a done deal because it's the partner to Mulberry. And when it's done, you'll have that pair converted. But then you look at this and you have walnut, chestnut, orange, king, and prince, duke, prince, queen, duke, and lime. My favorite nuts and fruits and royalty. So this is the current system, right? It's all one way. There's no doubt, I can tell you just unequivocally, based on experience in city after city after city, this is the ideal system for safety and for the success of your businesses. Now, this represents, there's no two ways about it, a slightly lower LOS, level of service, than this. LOS is the only measure, the dominant measure, not the only measure, the dominant measure that the state DOT has to use to determine, if they're doing what they define as their job, which is to move as many cars as possible. That's their mandate. They have a budget, it's limited, they have to move as many cars as possible, so they want to give you the highest LOS. Now in planning term, LOS stands for lack of success, because it means your downtown will not thrive. Good, successful downtowns have lower levels of service. So the question is, what's a proper compromise? And the DOT understands this. They're interested principally in the safety. They know that this is safer than this. And I think there's a willingness for a compromise. The question is, where is it? There's also the discussion, this is a longer term conversation. This won't happen in a year or 2 years. We have to start it now. It's already started. We have to start the conversation now, come to a conclusion, and then make it happen. But it's a longer term discussion. This is a smart compromise. And what this says is that you're converting Walnut and Chestnut, which you own, right? The top two streets you're converting. And then, importantly, the pair is not Prince and Queen. The pair is Prince and Lime. And that's important to understand. See the map here? See how the state highway splits, comes up Church and becomes Lime, right? So this is the pair that if you need to maintain a north-south pair, you can maintain the two on the edge. But that means that it allows Queen, which is a much better business street than Lime, to thrive, right? Now, there's even a better compromise, which is this, which is saying the real constraints are north-south, right? The geographical constraints are north-south. East-west, there isn't as much pressure on those streets, and the car counts show it. So why don't we also convert King and Orange? And people will say, oh, you can't convert King and Orange because of this intersection, right? But that intersection worked once, right? So how do we fix that? And the answer is actually you take this, right? One way, with Marietta, is it Marietta? One way this direction, and you just reverse Marietta, and then you've got two-way here and two-way here. And these guys just have to do that, right? And then it works just fine. So it's totally doable. So the question is, this is a great compromise. Then of course the ideal is all green. But I think we need to find what spot we're on. So we have this hierarchy then. Mulberry, Charlotte, easy. Walnut, Chestnut, ours, so doable. Queen and Duke next. That's at least something for the state to give us. King and Orange, they're a little more generous. And then Prince and Lime if they want to set a real standard. And where we land on this hierarchy is not certain, but that's what we need to work out with the state. It's a long-term effort. But the larger point I want to make is you don't do it street by street. Because every time you change it, you've got to change signals. And every time you change a pair, you've got to change the signals again, right? So it's total mayhem and totally unaffordable if you do a street, then a street, then a street. So my advice is that you pick where you want to land on this hierarchy and then you do it. And that's the long-term advice, and there's no doubt that's the right choice. And the only thing I can say about other communities where this has been done, there's always been fear of this Carmageddon, of gridlock. It's never happened. It's never happened. So talk all the theory you want. The evidence is it always works out. And then the businesses do better and people are safer. Next, the turn lane presence and length. So this is the turn lane that killed a whole block of Bethlehem, where I did some work, and you can see why. All these stores are dead because the parallel parking got ripped from the curb because we needed a 300-foot turn lane to a street with 7 houses, right? And that's what happens when you let your turn lanes get too long. The question to ask first is, do we need it? And secondly, how long should it be? So this is the difference between heaven and hell on a street like, frankly, on Queen, on King, on Orange, and on Prince. This is heaven. This is a great urban street. 2 lanes of parking, 2 lanes of driving. And then this is hell. The parking, it's 3 wide lanes. There's no parallel parking to protect the curb. And this is half of every block in the heart of your downtown. Think about it. It's half of King, it's half of Prince, it's half of Queen, it's half of Orange. Great and bad. And so we need to talk about how long those turn lanes are. Next, there's geometry. Are you swoopy or are you not swoopy? And I read this last time as a joke about objective journalism. It says, some say the entrance to city center is not inviting to pedestrians. Oh, really? Because whenever you have swoops, streamform geometrics, it communicates an automotive environment. People tend to speed up around curves, and it's not a place for people. And that also applies to curb radius. What's the radius of the curvature of this curve, of this corner, so that when you cross the street, are you crossing 20 feet or are you crossing 40 feet? That's all very important. And it applies also, the swoopy versus the non-swoopy is really central when it comes to the design of turn lanes. This is a classic American turn lane. This happens to be in Albuquerque. Notice about 50, 60 feet from the corner, the parallel parking stops and the traffic just kind of moves over and the turn lane is put there in the middle of the street. This is an urban turn lane. This is a highway turn lane. This happens to be South Duke. And you see there's got this swoop. You've got to swoop right before you go left, because if you're going 60, that's the right approach, right? Similarly, this is Mulberry Street, where it ends. There isn't even opposing traffic there. There shouldn't even be a turn lane here, because there's no opposing traffic. But somehow, what this tells me is, and don't feel bad, this is everywhere. Your public works department has inherited a standard that's a highway standard. When it comes time to build a street, they put in as long a turn lane as possible, and they put in this huge swoop, which wipes out 150 feet of parallel parking that should be there serving businesses. So you've got to make sure you've got the right model. And then there's, this may be a world record, this curve. This is where South Duke meets Church. And if this were tighter, yes, it would be a slightly tighter angle to get from here to there. So you'd actually have to look. You'd actually have to hang up the phone and look where you were going, right? So those are the things we have to be careful about. And then what everyone told me was the worst spot in downtown is the intersection of Prince and Walnut. Boo hiss, no clapping, boo hiss. Where we've done something that's only done on highways. And the only other place you'll see it is on the Harrisburg Pike. It's a highway solution. Right-hand turn lanes only add marginally to the capacity of a street. What a right-hand turn lane does is it lets you go faster. But think about it. There's no opposing traffic with a right-hand turn, so all it's really doing is just speeding people. And it really speeds people up. And of course, the sidewalk gets narrower. It's really, and there's this highway stripe in the middle of the street, right? So this is a really horrible spot because it's got this swoopy geometry. Then the best of all, the good news is it's not entirely in Lancaster. The bad news is it's about to be remade as two-way with the pork chop still in there, right? And the pork chop is as swoopy as you can get. So you never want to have pork chops. It's a highway geometry. Next, curb protection, which is on-street parking principally. On-street parking is an essential barrier of steel that protects the pedestrian from moving vehicles. It's also really important to businesses. 15 years ago, the National Trust for Historic Preservation said that every on-street parking space was worth $10,000 a year in revenue to a nearby business. And that was a long time ago. So we know that to be a fact. And I showed this pier last time. This is Fort Lauderdale. This is happy hour. You're allowed to park on this side of the street. You're not allowed to park on this side of the street. This is happy hour on the left, and this is happy hour on the right. Because no one wants to sit within 3 feet of a vehicle moving 60 feet per second. So it's really important. This just sums up the experience of being in a street that doesn't have parallel parking, right? So again, you have heaven and you have hell and more hell, and you really don't enjoy these places. So I'm all for the two-way reversion, and I'm pushing for the two-way reversion, and I think that's a long-term conversation you need to have with PennDOT, but we need to have an ask that's for right now. And I'm calling that the strategy. And everywhere I go, it's different. And in the scope of things, this is so unambitious, but it's going to be hard. But I think we need to state it outright, and we need to demand it, and hopefully we can get it. And what the strategy is simply taking those 160-foot long left-hand turn lanes and making them normal length. Making them an 80-foot facility, 40 feet of storage and 40 foot of what they call taper, right? It broadens into that lane. If you have 80-foot turn lanes instead of the 220-foot turn lanes that you currently have on Prince, on Queen, on Orange, and on King, you gain back this much more street that goes from no parking at all to parallel parking on both sides. It goes from a bad urban environment that's bad for walking and bad for shops to a good urban environment. It's very simple. It's not that big an ask. We're not even taking away the turn lanes. We're just making them shorter. None of the signalization needs to change, right? And you can test it by putting a truck on a street. They're going to say traffic study, woot woot, 3-year traffic study. Park some trucks on some streets in these red zones and see what happens. Or cars, or police cars. So easy to test in real time in a week. And that's the strategy. It's a modest proposal, though not the same as Jonathan Swift's. But it's not a big ask. It's a very small ask. It will make a huge difference. And I'm convinced this is the key moment in my presentation tonight, is getting you to do this. So you can call it that, or I have another name from a Pennsylvania WPA poster, the Don't Run Us Down proposal. Thank you. Now, why? This is the larger philosophy, which is essentially, you know, it does slow you down a little bit. It does. It slows you down a little bit to have a downtown that's worth being in. But is it a 20-minute commute that's 45 miles an hour the whole way, or a less than 21-minute commute that has a slower speed area in the downtown? So we're not asking you to hobble the whole highway. We're just asking you to make it a little bit calmer in the heart of the downtown. Next, there's a lot of missing parking in places that I just can't figure out. And a lot of it isn't state streets at all, it's city-owned streets. And I do this wherever I go, I do a hunt. Where is there missing parking that you can't explain? Where is it ruled out for reasons that you can't explain? Here it's for a court. I'm not sure, maybe this is a legitimate reason, but I hardly ever saw vehicles there. Do we need that much space? There's a lot of places for bus stops that seem to be extremely long, longer than the buses need to be. There are bus stops on curbs half a block from the bus center. Why is that? Shouldn't people go to the bus center to catch a bus instead of ruining a whole curb for parking? Right? So these are everywhere. There's loading zones, there's taxi zones, there's no reason zones. There's 50 feet before the zone that makes sense, but why are you backing up 50 feet? And then lots of other conditions. In front of the East King Street parking lot, there are 2 entries into that parking lot that are each about 12 feet wide that wipes out 120 feet of parking because of an extreme site angle requirement that's not in keeping with any other place. So you need to do an inventory. I've started. So applying the strategy and applying this inventory of all these spots I could find, often it's just 1 here, 1 there, 2 there, 4 there, but it all adds up to 160 spaces. And you're running out of parking in your parking lots. That would be, if you were to build a lot that held that would be $3.2 million. So it's worth doing the inventory. Wherever you see a number on this map, just go check it out and ask yourself, does this really have to be no parking? And then put the parking back if you can. I'm guessing legitimately you've got about 120, 130 spaces there. But half of them are coming from the strategy. In fact, the majority are coming from the strategy. And then stripe it. And the reason you should stripe it is because when no one's parking on the curb, then the travel lane just seems to be extra wide. So the stripe, in the absence of parking, makes the driver know that they're on a 10-foot lane and not on an 18-foot lane. Street trees. The other part of the equation, they make pedestrians much more comfortable, as well as much more safe. They absorb stormwater, they absorb CO2, they do amazing stuff. They slow cars down. But they only slow the cars down if they're between you and the cars. And it's very clear what the right way is to plant a street tree. This is just a little bit further down North Queen Street. I'm not sure what happened here. Maybe they were trying to hide the parking garage. But, many a slip tweaks the cup and the lip. We just can't let this happen. It tells me that there's something wrong with either your ordinances or your enforcement that this can happen here. Bike lanes. I like to say biking is the greatest planning revolution currently underway in only some American cities. And there's a clear relationship between infrastructure and bike population. There's nothing more obvious. If you build the lanes like they did in Portland, you get the bike populations that you get in Portland. Chicago has had a huge increase in bicyclists with its new bike lanes. And this is the gold standard, the buffered bike lane, also known as a cycle track. You pull the parked cars off the curb 12 feet or even 10 feet, whatever, 10 feet is enough. And you get a 2-way bike lane and a car door buffer. And these are the sort of lanes that when they're introduced to cities, people go into the basement, they pull their bikes out of the basement, and they start riding again. Because they make everyone feel safe. And statistically, they make the women and the children start biking again. Your bicycle mix here is like 88, I forgot the number, but it's like 88% male. And one reason is you don't have much in facilities. So here's one in New York City. Again, parking pulled off the curb, cycle track introduced. Of course, the number of cyclists tripled. Of course, speeding dropped from 75% to 17% of all drivers. Isn't that fantastic? And injury crashes dropped by 63%. But amazingly, no fewer cars are getting through this street on peak hour than before. I'm not sure why, but it's a win-win-win. if instead of doing this with the buffered bike lanes, if you believe that every lane is a bike lane like they do in Pasadena, then this is the only bicyclist I met in Pasadena. So without the infrastructure, you don't get the cyclists. So you've got plenty of these, right? This is Google. The Google truck was chasing these cyclists through Lancaster. And you've got guys like this, the hale and hardy vehicular cyclists who make it work despite the displeasure. But what we're looking for is more of this. The urban cycling is just a way to get around. And these posters, you ever seen one of these? Postcards? So I've got a new one. There's your cycling network right now. You're just this part of the country, this very part of the country is way behind the rest of the country. And you guys need to catch up. You can catch up, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, crosswalk design. It's important to have them, paint them, especially the ones where people are getting hit or almost getting hit very frequently. But, something like this shouldn't be a swoop. But look at there's really only one, the standard DOT response and the traditional traffic engineer response to create safety in an intersection is to minimize the conflict points, to limit the number of crosswalks. But that just adds to a ton of jaywalking. Because if you're walking, if you're walking here and you want to go there, you're not going to, do this. How are you supposed to do that? The path through the intersection, this is actually a signalized crosswalk. The path through the intersections are so few that everyone jaywalks, making it twice as dangerous. And then here's the other one, which is where Church meets Queen. That was brought to my attention as a particularly dangerous, particularly high incident place. And this idea that you just shouldn't, no pedestrians here, please, right? So, use the Ross Walk. This wouldn't work either. But the point is, you need to have a crosswalk there. And so the solution is to map out the desire lines. What are the desire lines in this intersection? And these are the desire lines. These are where people are going to be walking. If you don't mark it for them, you'll just have more dangerous crossing. And you need to change the signals as well. Not all of these need signals, but they need to have a condition where the car understands that pedestrians are welcome. And then this one, well, first you have to get rid of the pork chop, and then you do this, right? You extend the curbs and get rid of the pork chop, and then anywhere people are crossing is where you put the crosswalk. So that is the current technique, and that's what's missing from the remake that they're about to spend a lot of money on up here. We have finished with safety factors. Now we're going to get into the individual streets. This is the biggest slog in this talk. I'm going to take you very quickly, but I'm going to take you street through all the streets that I'm recommending changes to, based then on everything that we've talked about before. First is Mulberry. Mulberry has already proposed to go two-way. Here's the two-way plan, and what I noticed, this is to be lauded. It's great, and it's already in engineering, but the paint has not yet been laid. It's not too late to change the paint. And what I see here is 8.2-foot parking lanes and 10.5-foot driving lanes next to 4.7-foot bike lanes. 5 feet is the bike lane standard. 6 feet is the new bike lane standard. You don't want to get much wider than 6 because then cars try to drive in them, okay? But 6 feet is the goal. And here, because you've got 10.5-foot travel lanes and 8.2-foot parking lanes, you have a small bike lane. So here's the proposed, and here's the planned, and here's what I'm proposing, is basically 8-foot parking lanes and a 6-foot bike lane and 2 10-foot driving lanes. Very simple. Don't even go through the planning. Just when the truck's out there, just guide it properly, right? And if someone says you have to do an environmental impact statement, then just shoot me now. Now, the other thing you're noticing is a 20-foot shared way. Where'd the center line go? Now, this I say with a little bit of care, but these are brand new studies. This study is like 1 year old. And what this study in England showed, when you repave a street, and there was all sorts of controls, they repaved a whole bunch of streets. Some they put the center lines back, and some they didn't put the center lines back. If you leave the center line out, people go 7 miles an hour slower, basically bringing them down to the speed limit. Okay? So, and I was asked, well, it's a smart question. We're reverting one-way to two-way. Don't we need the center lane to tell people, to remind them it's a two-way? And my response was, I think the car coming in the opposite direction will remind them that it's a two-way. So that's what I'm recommending for Mulberry. Charlotte, exact same thing. Going from 13-foot travel lanes to 20-foot shared lane or 210s, which gives you a 6-foot bike lane, and going from one-way to two-way, as is currently hoped. James, now let's talk about, all these streets are the same. James, Lemon, Walnut, Chestnut, as well as the two I just mentioned, they're holding in 39 to 44 feet what a typical street holds in 34 to 36 feet. There's basically room for one bike lane in each one, not two. So you do what we're proposing, what the city had already proposed for Mulberry and Charlotte, which is you do a split pair. You have two two-way streets, and the bike lane splits between them. One goes north and one goes south. In this case, one goes east, one goes west. So the solution for James and for Lemon and for Chestnut and Walnut is all the same. You've got this extra 5 feet. You can feel it in this roadway. And you go from 13-foot lanes to 10-foot lanes plus a bike lane. That varies from 5 feet up. Lemon Street, exact same thing, an extra 5. This is where Mr. Lehman was killed. And I have to say, this is very memorable. His choice of travel is at the center of his demise. You know, why does that have to be? And that's why I'm here, right? The choice of your choice of travel shouldn't be at the center of your demise. And I look at this guy, I didn't know this guy. I can tell from the picture that he's a wonderful guy. And I hate to see this happen. And, you know, we don't know whether striping like this would stop this from happening. But every little bit counts. Every little signal you can send the driver, that bike lane, every little signal you can send the driver that they're in a narrower lane is going to impact the speed at which they're traveling. So it's important. So Lemon Street, the same thing. Walnut Street, the same thing. We've got 14-foot lanes, 14 or more. Make them 10 feet. That gets you big parking lanes and a big 6-foot bike lane. Chestnut Street, same thing, or maybe not. Here's where we have two choices. We're going to get into the bike plan in a minute. We talked about the buffered protected bike lane as the dream solution. You pull the parking off the curb. In this case, we're taking a one-way street. We're keeping it one way. We pull the parking off the curb. We put in a buffer and a two-way buffered bike lane. Now, this lowers your capacity. And the question is, does it lower your capacity more than you're willing to take? The numbers suggest it should work out just fine. And again, there's never been a Carmageddon when something like this has happened. But this is suggesting actually that we make an exception because there's no other good way to insert a buffered lane in your east-west in your downtown. So what I'm suggesting is Chestnut being the closest to the downtown, to the heart of the downtown that you control, is the proper choice to put in a buffered lane. Or you can be wimpy and do the same as Walnut. I should say both solutions are very good solutions. A two-way Chestnut with a one-way bike lane that mirrors a two-way Walnut with a one-way bike lane is great. This is greater. Orange Street, here's where we kick into the strategy. Orange Street has these two super long turn lanes. So approaching Queen, you've got 3 11-foot lanes where you could have two. And see that? You make the turn lane shorter and the parking lane kicks in. Here approaching Market, same thing. Well, here actually there's no turn lane because you're approaching Market, but you've got an 18-foot lane. We can fix that. Here approaching Prince, you've got this super long extra turn lane. And here by shortening the turn lane, this one's the turn lane. By shortening it, you can have cars on both sides of the street all the way to within 80 feet of the corner, making it a viable street for walking and retail, much more so than now. And it's 984 cars at peak hour. Remember the 500 number? Right? So theoretically, you only need 2 lanes. We're saying 2 lanes plus a turn lane, but a short turn lane. King Street. Here you've got super long turn lanes and then just an extra block, actually, from Mulberry for no explicable reason. That's 3 lanes. I'm sure there's a reason. But here as it approaches Penn Square, rather than these super long extra lane, you neck down to 2, 80 feet away, and you get parking on both sides, all the way up to here. This guy's crazy. But all the way up to here. And the car counts are 798. So you don't even need that third lane, in theory. And again, you can test this with just parking a car in the street when you're ready to test it. Prince Street is a little different. Prince Street has two little places where we could shorten the turn lanes heading south. But you've got this condition where you want to get rid of that swoop. And eventually the city staff plans to rebuild it. And Charlotte from planning is really on top of all this stuff, and they're going to put one of their lovely rain gardens in there. But in the short term, just restripe it. And then notice that these two 13-foot travel lanes mean actually we can park on both sides of the street, all the way to the corner, not just one side of the street. See that? And notice I'm changing dots, which means the parking is unmarked, to lines, which means the parking is marked. And then you have further north where it's 34 feet. So 34 feet, it's actually 34 feet and up, which the DOT has deemed too narrow for parking on both sides. So the parking is only on one side, but you can see there's room for parking on both sides. So we look at Lime Street and we convince them to bring parking back for that whole stretch. Queen Street, now the newer the street is, the wider it is. And Queen was remade recently beautifully with these bulb outs and all the best bricks and everything else. And while we're enhancing your landscape, we're going to make it more like a highway. Because that's what happens. 17-foot travel lane? Why? So you have a 13-foot travel lane, a 17-foot travel lane, when you could have parking on both sides of the street rather than just one side of the street. Very simple. And then we talked about further north on Queen, applying the strategy, shortening the left-hand turn lane. So this parking that you have south of there can continue all the way up. We're at capacity with 2 lanes. So keep the turn lanes, but keep them short. Now Church Street is the most oversized street in your downtown. And here, you've already got parking on both sides of the street, so what do? And here we say, why not have another cycle track? Not because it necessarily connects anything to anything else, but we've got 15 extra feet. We've got 3 lanes averaging 13 feet. If you put 10-foot lanes in, you end up with 15 feet. 5 plus a 5-foot buffer of a cycle track. And then what I'm going to be showing you now, and I'm going very quickly, is just a whole bunch of streets that all have the same solution, which is there's too much pavement. The parallel parking solutions that are already on this street, these streets are the ones they should keep. They're either already parked or there's no demand for parking. So this is where we insert bike lanes just to use up pavement. And this is really important. The bike lanes I'm suggesting to you, some of them are because of need, but a lot of them are just to use up pavement. And you should put them there just to narrow the perceived driving lanes. So South Duke, 16-foot lanes, 13-foot lanes, put in bikes. Further south, 17-foot lanes, put in bikes. Further south, this intersection with Chesapeake where you have these highway swoops, see that? A turn lane that could be this long is this long, wiping out parking for this long, right? So fix that, and that's fixing it. That's the old standard with the swoop. This is the new standard with just the chamfer, the bevel. And then also you've got currently a 12-foot lane, a 13-foot lane, and a 20-foot lane. So let's have bike lanes to use up that space. Chesapeake Street, the only thing wrong here is the speed limit, right? Make it a 50 and this works. But it's not a street where you want people going 50. Here you've got room, you've got 18 extra feet. So put in a bike lane with a striped buffer. If you put in a 9-foot bike lane, people will drive in it. So put in a 5-foot bike lane with a 4-foot buffer and you're done. This is all just paint, right? When it rounds the corner towards Broad. Now here we don't need 3 lanes. These are 10-foot lanes. You don't need 3 lanes. The travel volumes don't suggest 3 lanes, which is a suicide lane that allows speeding. So you put in bike lanes instead, right? Hershey, 15-foot lanes. Broad, aptly named, 18-foot lanes. There are others. These are the only ones I saw. What I'm trying to do here is teach you to fish. You've got this kit of parts, 7-foot parking lanes, 10-foot driving lanes, 6-foot bike lanes. When you find a street that's got 12-foot lanes, 13-foot lanes, 17-foot lanes, fill them up. Restripe. And this is a point I want to make. Most American cities, yours included, like to apply for the money from the federal government, from the state, wait for the money, and then rebuild the whole thing with rain gardens. And I'm saying, that's all well and good, but I'd much rather see you restripe 10 streets than rebuild 1 for the same price. And you can do it fast. And then people can say in 3 years that I had an impact. Right? Okay, stretch. Here's where I switch my shows. Feel free to stand up and stretch your legs. Don't leave if you don't care to leave. Alt, tab. Okay. So those were all the individual streets. The hard part of the show is done, and now we get into the fun part. Harrisburg Pike should be your campus main street. Harrisburg Pike, well, first it leaves Prince Street, or approaches Prince Street, and it has these highway geometrics. It has these 13-foot lanes, which are just too wide. Then when it gets to campus, it has these highway right-hand turn lanes, which again, a right-hand turn lane marginally increases capacity at a great cost of safety. So these are wrong. This is a command, race the Harrisburg Pike, because that is what the geometry is telling you. So here, it's a simple solution. You make these 13 and 14-foot lanes 10 feet, and you get a parking lane. I would put the parking lane along the entire south flank of that street, the entire south flank. Then when you get into campus, it's a little trickier. But essentially what you can do is turn these right-hand turn lanes into parking lanes. But also, if you turn the 12-foot lanes, of which there are 4, into 10-foot lanes, you get a whole other row of parking on the other side of the street. And this is so tricky because of all these swoops that were created. And I don't want to make anyone rebuild anything, least of all the state, who has to find the money. So I actually did a design to show you how to do it. This is the existing, with it highlighted. This is the existing geometry. And this is the fix. And I'm going to zoom in here. What you see is 10-foot lanes, left-hand turn lanes. This should say left, not right. Left-hand turn lanes. Parking, parking. And then where it swoops, you have to do a little bit of a chamfer. And just fill in, and maybe you lose a little bit of parking where it narrowly gets below 8 feet. Right? But basically what you've got now is a street that's continuously lined by parking on both sides. Here further east, before, after. Filling in the left-hand turn lanes, filling in the right-hand turn lanes, and making 10-foot travel lanes, which all the data now tells us are safer, so the state can't say they're more dangerous, and putting in parking lanes on the other side of the street. With all the students that I saw crossing the street, with the fields that have been moved to the north side of the street and all the activity, this is a death trap, and it's not a campus center, and it needs to be fixed soon. So I think that has to be a high priority. Now, what I'm calling the Bike Network Foundation. I showed you this already. Here's what I'm proposing. This is not a cycling network. This is a network foundation. It's just the stuff that my plan has my study has led me to recommend, which is to say that these are all the streets that have room for lanes and should have lanes in them to be safer, plus a couple things. Plus, we're going to talk about Christian Street. We already talked about Chestnut as a likely possible cycle track. Everything, plus Millersville University has a very nice way, not a path, not a lane, has a very nice way to get downtown, which is Wabank connecting to Hazel. It needs to be a designated bike route and signaled and signed and posted and striped as a shared way. There's not room for lanes, and we don't need lanes because they're calm streets. But if this were a designated high-profile bike route, then Millersville kids would be much more likely to come downtown. But everything else you see, the Hershey's and the Chesapeakes and the Broads and the South Dukes, everything else you see is just where the lanes need to go, with one exception, which is this, which is Christian Street. Oh, we're zoomed in here. So, and this is one choice, and this is the other choice. See the difference? The only difference is Chestnut. Two-way pair or cycle track. But what I'm calling the Christian Street Bikeway, this is now the big expensive idea. Every plan has to have one big expensive idea. There is no good way to bike north-south in the heart of downtown. Mulberry and Charlotte are not in the heart of downtown, and Prince, Queen, Duke, and Lime are all state DOT, forget about it, right? We can be hopeful about putting this in Church Street just because it's so embarrassingly over capacity. But these 4 are not embarrassingly over capacity. So how do we have a way to bike, just a way to bike north-south? And I think the answer is Christian Street. I'm going to take you now on Christian Street, basically from here to the train station. And it's really lovely. I'm not suggesting it lose any of its current function. It should stay as a street when it's a street, an alley when it's an alley, loading when it's loading. But look at this path. Imagine if it were all repaved, restriped, signalized and signed as a bikeway. Oops, what's that? That is this, which the Hotel Lancaster wants to remove and is ready to remove. So we get rid of that, carry on. Very safe, very pleasant, beautiful proportioned space that takes you all the way to and through the hospital, useful to get from the hospital to the train station, and eventually lands you, oh, hello ladies, lands you at the train station. It's really, it couldn't be better. And the fact that you see the train station at the end of it is kind of the coup de grace, right? It's fantastic. But then there's this. All the streets, the oranges, the kings, the vines, the chestnuts and walnuts that it needs to cross. And this is the challenge. Now, when you're on King Street right now, you see the sign in the middle of the street, watch out for pedestrians, and the cars being careful about people moving east-west, people moving north-south in line with Christian Street when they're crossing King. The proper way to handle this is with a raised speed table where you have a marked crosswalk for the full width of the intersection that's raised to the height of the sidewalks. And so these guys rise up. It's not a speed bump, it's gentle. But these guys rise up and fall down. And it's clear that this is a way across and through. And then you have bold signage and maybe what are called HAWK signals, pedestrian activated flashing lights or bike activated flashing lights that just tell people to be careful. So here's what this intersection looks like now, and here's what it should look like, where the bikeway is marked across the street and you rise up and you fall down. And notice this is coplanar now with the sidewalk. That's the way to do this properly, and that is not cheap. The kind of thing you can ask others to pay for, whether it be HUD or EPA or other folks. By the way, the name Christian Street, Christianity and bikes go together very nicely. It's catchy. I've got a logo for you. And, but you know, maybe we don't want that. Maybe we don't want that. Maybe we call it the Munificent Donor Bikeway. Or shorthand, I'm calling it the Where Bikeway. And, you know, imagine what this could be. I'm going to get hell for that. So that's the big expensive idea that I think is really going to change, because you actually need it. You need this to really be a biking city. And I tried everything else, but I really think that's the way to do it. Then I just wanted to show you this intersection, which we already improved, like this. Once you add that bike lane to Church, right? That's the Church Street cycle track that I told you about. That turns Church into the only being twice as wide as the traffic demands, right? But it's a foundation. You're about to embark on your city and county cycling plan. This was prepared in preparation for that. And my instructions to you is that everything in here in some form needs to find its way into that plan. I hope it does. But that's, I've done some legwork. They have to lower their feet for the plan now, Mayor. So Penn Square, I think, is a real easy win. It's very dangerous. There's a ton of jaywalking here because people jaywalk. The crossings aren't well marked, but even if these were solid, it wouldn't be well marked. But the big challenge is this monument. So I suggest that you tear it down. Just kidding. The monument, which must stay here, if you're standing here to cross, or even if you're standing here to cross, which is where you stand, If you're standing here to cross, you can't see past the monument to these cars. If you're standing here to cross, you can't see past the monument to these cars coming north. And it's really deadly. Thank goodness for 10-foot lanes. This is what 10-foot lanes do. 10-foot lanes allow you to extend the curb about 9 feet here. Notice, this is all just a thickening of the curb. Now, these are about to be re-bricked anyway as they rebuild this area, so we can re-brick those nice and bright. But the key thing is to extend the curb beyond and around the monument. I've put little stem walls here so no one's tempted to walk around here. No one's allowed to get into this zone. But you come out here and here to cross. And now you're crossing 21, 22 feet and not 30 feet. And I can say this works in theory. I know it works from my experience, but I received a gift from heaven on the last day that I was in town. And I looked out my window from the Marriott, and your Christmas tree truck was putting up your Christmas tree decorations and absorbing fully 9 feet of the street. And I watched out my window in utter amazement, or not, at rush hour, as the traffic just plowed through, as it always plows through, perhaps a little slower than usual. Buses, cars, trucks, SUVs, you name it, through this intersection. And this is why I say two things. I say, A, you can do it. And B, stop doing traffic studies. Just start doing stuff like this, right? So that's Penn Square. So we're done. We're done with the safe walk. Now we're going to move on to the quick other parts of the show. But they're very important and interesting. The useful walk and the comfortable and interesting walk. The useful walk is essentially a factor of housing, parking, transit, and wayfinding. There's more I could talk about, but these are the key issues here in downtown Lancaster. In downtown Lancaster, as in most American downtowns, your housing to workplace ratio is off. The more housing you have downtown, the more greater balance of uses you'll have, the more nighttime activity you'll have, the more everything will do better. So it's not rocket science, but actually it makes a big difference. You know, and you've already made some real progress in terms of getting residential and students from the art school and other stuff in the upstairs of these buildings. But this sounds kind of dumb, but you'd be surprised what you can accomplish if you actually make downtown housing, increasing it quickly and attainably as a stated city priority. That was done in Lowell, Massachusetts, and in 8 years they doubled in the thousands. They doubled the amount of downtown housing from like 4,000 to 8,000 in less than a decade because they stated it as a priority and they reoriented their city ordinances around that priority. Secondly, you should introduce, for the areas immediately surrounding downtown, a backyard cottage ordinance, a granny flat ordinance that allows and encourages people to put small apartments in their backyards, as is happening in dozens and dozens of cities around the US. It's called an ADU ordinance, accessory dwelling unit ordinances. It allows people to make money off their property. It allows people to have their kid or elderly parent come back and live near them. It allows actually for affordability to come in to neighborhoods in small increments and always supervised. And when affordability is not concentrated but is dispersed in this way, none of the negative, toxicities occur. So this is the way to introduce more affordable housing and more housing one way near your downtown. So those two things really, I talk about it more in the report, are really important. Parking, separate question. What is underpriced and overrepresented in your downtown and in most? And it is parking because you're not charging the right price. And you have this condition, and this is the Dean of American Parking, Don Shoup, who's figured it all out. He has a great book called The High Cost of Free Parking, and I'm not going to go through all three of his main points, but the key one is just to price the parking right so that the market can function right. And this is an early parking study from a city in California, and what it basically says is, where people want to park the most, you charge the most. Where people want to park the least, you charge the least. And by doing that, you achieve a goal of 1 empty space per block face at all times. That's an 85% occupancy. It means that Daddy Warbucks can find a place near the Furrier. And what you do here is you price your streets the same as your lots. And it's not cheap, but the streets are much more desirable than the lots. So you have like you have like no capacity on those most popular places. Alternately, you have places like Orange Street, west of say, west of Prince, where during rush hour no one's parked at all. And so it feels like a real highway because the price is too high. So the question isn't, the answer isn't charge more. The answer is charge a market-based price, a demand-based price. This is a very crude way to keep the churn going. And the parking meter was invented for merchants to benefit merchants. And that churn does that. But if you want to have the limited amount of availability that makes for success, then you need to change the pricing a little bit to reflect demand. It's not a big deal, but it's important. Actually, Don Shoup would tell you in a number of downtowns, it's been the key to success. Transit, you are well served regionally by the bus system, by the Red Rose bus system. And I should say, this is like a good and bad picture. This is the best transit center in terms of how it meets the street, how it welcomes the buses that I've probably ever seen. Really world class. The buses seem a little big for the number of people that are riding on them. And I have a theory about this, which is that when the transit system directors go to their annual conventions, what they do is they compare the size of their buses. But it just seems, when the buses get too big, then they start saying, oh, we need 11-foot lanes, we need super long stops. In fact, this bus, this huge bus is 8.5 feet from side to side and 10.5 feet from mirror to mirror, and the mirrors are above head height. They don't hit anything except other buses. So in fact, buses like this work perfectly well in 10-foot lanes, don't worry, because there's always give. There's always give in an adjacent lane. But I do wonder why your buses are so big. And I don't have an axe to grind. Just because the head of the transit authority was the only person who refused to meet with me doesn't mean I'm mad at him. Okay? Now, you have this trolley. This trolley is a great idea, and it was managed wrong. And it's going away. You may not know this. Your trolley is going away because no one's using it. And almost no one's using it because it's 20-minute waits, which means you have to look at a schedule. It's limited hours, which means you can't go to dinner and take the trolley home. And there's limited outreach. I was staying at the Marriott. The Marriott's fantastic. I need to go to the train station, and they call me a taxi. There's no mention of the trolley. There's no interconnect between the trolley and the downtown and all the merchants who it was designed to benefit. There's no connection because it's not being run by those people. So my suggestion is don't do this, do this. Right? This organization doesn't want it, and they're actually not, this is not casting aspersions, they're not the right organization to run it because their mission statement doesn't align with the trolley's mission statement, which is to bring life to downtown and to make the stores do better, make the hotels do better, make you more of a tourist center. If you really want the trolley to do that, then the answer is actually 10-minute waits because you never have to look at a schedule, late hours, and then a big outreach. The community, the merchants, I think this is kind of a half City Hall effort and half business, downtown business district, Chamber of Commerce effort to support this thing. Now there's an alternative. This could be the long-term solution or maybe the mid-term solution. The alternative is simply to meet every train. You have one of the busiest train stations in America. I think it's the third busiest in the state of Pennsylvania. You have a ton of people coming in 16 times a day, and it's ridiculous that they're not met by a trolley. The problem is that there's only 16 trains a day. So what do you do between meeting the train from downtown and returning to downtown from the train? Well, that's why the city should run this, or the chamber. I forget what you're called. But between those two trains, this person can be a policeman. This person can be a downtown ambassador. This person can be a safety officer walking around. So half the job you're meeting the train and half the job you're walking around. But that's a short-term, I think, must-do, is to meet every train with the trolley. And maybe not this, maybe something smaller. But the real cost isn't the size of the vehicle, it's the staff. That's why I'm having this conversation. Streetcar. We hope Jeff would come and say blah about the streetcar. I'm not convinced about the streetcar. I think, for me, it's all about seeing successes in other cities. And the fact is that there is no city of your size that I know about that has a successful streetcar. The closest is Kenosha. Kenosha is twice your size. Now, to be fair, Kenosha is like 10 times your size physically twice your size population. So you probably have a population density around your loop. This is Kenosha's loop. Very similar to what yours would be from the station to downtown. You have a population density around your loop that's greater than Kenosha's. But Kenosha, you know, what people forget is they say, oh, the feds will pay for this and the state will pay for this and EPA will pay for that. And lo and behold, we funded a trolley. And then you've got $4 of operational cost per passenger mile in Kenosha. Now, they've still deemed this a success and they're expanding it. So it's a good thing for Kenosha. But it's a tremendous investment and there's no other city your size that's done it. And my feeling is, why do that when you can get 90% of the way there with this? And with all the money you save, the final thing that makes this great is that you don't charge anything to get on it. So 10-minute headways, late hours, a hell of a publicity effort, and make it free. Okay. Thanks. Now, wayfinding is something I bring up in only some of the cities where I work. You guys are doing it pretty well. I think in terms of you've got nice signs, and the only thing that might be missing is directing drivers more quickly to the garages. Because I think they're having trouble finding the garages or not necessarily knowing about the garages. So you might consider some signs, not big highway signs, but signs that direct drivers better to garages. But I want to call your attention to something called guerrilla wayfinding, because it's now becoming non-guerrilla and state-endorsed wayfinding. It's something called Walk Your City that's taking the nation by storm. It's based in Raleigh, where I was last week. I brought it to Santa Fe, where it's had a great impact. And what it does is it connects anchors, but it connects them by walking, telling you it's a 16-minute walk to Seaboard Station. Imagine, I wish the walk were nicer, but imagine it's a 7-minute walk to the North Queen Street Retail District. It's a 5-minute walk to the Demuth Museum. It's a 10-minute walk to the baseball park or the train station. All these things that might be a little more likely to be walked if the signage was there. And a funny story is, I did walkability studies in West Palm Beach recently, which has a pretty cool downtown, and Albuquerque, which is working real hard to have a great downtown. And I recommended this to West Palm Beach, and I was about to put it in my Albuquerque report, and I started scratching my head. I'm like, there are no good anchors in downtown Albuquerque. So I didn't recommend this. In fact, that's not true, but there just aren't enough. There aren't enough. Lancaster has more good anchors than West Palm Beach. So I really feel this is something that you should investigate quickly. And then finally, the comfortable and interesting walk. What are the comfort and interest factors? Next, I'm going to talk about paths and anchors, the bull of the block, the Prince Street garage edge, and I'm ending with the Central Market. That's my last segment tonight. Comfort and interest factors. I talked about this last time. All animals seek prospect and refuge. You want to see your predators and feel that your flanks are covered from attack. If you do not feel street walls, if you do not feel edges to the spaces you're in, you are not comfortable in those spaces, which is why we go to places like this on holiday. We've been talking about it for a long time. What's the ideal ratio? 3-to-1 is great. 1-to-6, you start to lose your enclosure. Trees help a lot. 6-to-1 can be fantastic. This is Salzburg. The opposite of Salzburg is Houston. This is an old slide of Houston. I was in Houston. Oh my gosh. I was in Houston last week. The Central, has anyone been to Midtown Houston? It's amazing. It looks like Berlin. So this is an old slide. They're doing much better. But the point is that the surface parking lot is usually the main culprit here. And it's places like this where through one, brief period where you were comatose in the 70s, you allowed a McDonald's to pull back. Maybe it was the 90s. I don't know. Cities are still doing it. You allowed a building to pull back from the sidewalk and put the parking lot in front. Something you will never do again. But, that's comfort. In terms of interest, 1-to-1 is ideal, but, this is 1-to-1. And when one side is my favorite joke, forgive me those of you who have heard it before, when one side of the street is an exposed parking deck and the other side is a hotel conference facility that was apparently designed in admiration for that exposed parking deck, then you get the spatial enclosure, but you don't get the interest. So it only takes 20 feet of building to hide 200 feet of garage. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Again, paths and anchors. Here are the key pedestrian anchors in my study area. If you happen to own one of them and it's not marked, my fault. But this was my best guess. Of course, you have the baseball field, the YMCA, the hospital, the North Queen Retail District, the principal retail district on Queen and King. You've got the market hall, right? The central market here. You've got all that's going on Duke Street, and the convention center and hotel down here. I forgot Hotel Lancaster. That should be orange also. This is the path system that connects those anchors. This determines where people are likely to walk. And because you need all four things, you need the useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting walk. If it's not useful and if it's not comfortable and it's not interesting, then people probably aren't going to walk there. So these are the places where if we do our job right, we can get real pedestrian activity. You don't let all the rest of the streets go to pot. The rest of the streets are all great, but these are where we need to focus. And so the first 30 buildings that you need to build in your downtown, if walkability is the mandate, and it's not the only mandate, but were walkability the only mandate, these would be the first 30 buildings to put in your downtown. It happens to be 30 because that's what you get when you line these corridors with building edges. Wouldn't it be great as you approach the stadium to have an edge there? Instead of this, imagine this beautiful picture with, instead of the snouts of the cars, a beautiful building. And who wouldn't want to live on that block, you know, who likes baseball? So, and then further south, these are just the missing teeth along Prince Street, couple on Queen, and then further south, of course, completing the market, here in Gallery Row, the bull of a block, and missing corners. Missing corners. These are the most important. Hiding the edge of this parking lot, which already had, this is the newspaper parking lot? No, this is the newspaper parking lot. It already has a massive entrance, the size of a semi, right here. Doesn't need an entrance there. So that's the concept, is to hold the street edge so people feel that sense of enclosure. So what does that mean? A couple key sites. The bull of a block, you know, the face that sunk 1,000 ships, never very popular. And then the rubber tile plaza that I understand is an improvement on the previous plaza. And you have this condition where this is actually a big enough space. It doesn't need to be twice as wide. But also you have Mary Street, which was truncated by a block that's too big. And of course, if you improve the network, you improve walkability. So my proposal for this block, and notice it's just the barest rudimentary image because I'm not trying to design it for you. What I'm trying to tell you is hold the street edge, all of them, bring Mary Street through, and then maybe if you do a residential upstairs floor plate, and you know we need more residential, that creates nice courtyards in the center of each block, including one up against the hotel. So that's what I'm suggesting for this block. And notice the crosswalks that bring Mary Street through. Then there's the Prince Street garage edge, which is precisely the sort of condition. This is the view from your central market. It could be a little better. And this is a beautiful sunny day. Some might find this attractive. And then the view down Orange. It reminds you that it's Orange Street, at least in this picture. But look, amazingly, and to my great relief when I got there, there's a 15-foot gap that does nothing. There's also a sidewalk. It also faces south. It's not endemic to this location, but a great thing to have facing south is arcades, where the building comes over the sidewalk and you have columns on the edge of the sidewalk, because that sidewalk then gets sun in the winter and no sun, it gets shade in the summer. If you reach out over the sidewalk with a building like this, now from the other direction, this is what you get. See that? It's housing above little shops with an arcade. See this? The pedestrian goes under the building, like that hides the front of the building. David High is a local architect who I met, who reached out to me when I came here, and I commissioned him to do this study. So when I leave, he's still here, and this work is here, and it's ready to build. So here's his perspective. Here's now a section sliced through the edge of the garage, the pedestrian arcade, with micro retail kind of pulling off from the market hall. Incubator retail, a flat and a two-story apartment on top. Here you have plans, it's all done. Gately David. So you have shops below, residential above, a nice facade, and and that's a big difference. This will not make anyone money, except for all the retailers. This will not make anyone money, but it won't lose money. I mean, a developer won't do this because it's too complicated. The city has to help. But if the site is furnished essentially for free, with services, and with someone leading them by the arm through the permitting process, including building out over the sidewalk, which is always tricky, then this is ready to go. Finally, my last segment, the Central Market. It really wasn't until I left here, I think you don't understand, and it wasn't until I left here that I began to understand how truly amazing the potential of your Central Market is. It's already great, right? Everyone knows it's great. But it suffers from being much smaller than it could be. I don't mean the market hall itself, I mean the space at the middle of the block. And then it has these spaces that would be nice spaces, but continually it's nice retail on one side and parking lot on the other, right? Nice retail, parking. I'm not sure what this refers to, but not very inviting. And you have this condition then where just from fixing the streets, from a street edge, remember those blue lines, from lining the paths with buildings perspective, you need a better edge here, and a better edge here, and a better edge here. But what's really happening is this wasted potential of this really lowest and worst use of this parking lot in the center of the block. It could go underground, or we could locate other parking somewhere else, but you have such energy in this market hall. And what people really love are these European-sized spaces that are narrow and not too tall. And what you've got right now is this, and then it just dies, and you kind of have to turn around. But what you could have is this whole circuit, all the way north-south, all the way east-west, and a whole nother world in here that achieves a critical mass by putting building across from building, and building across from itself. And then notice here I've pulled back 30 feet to create a plaza in front of the Ware Center, which we're in right now. And this is the spirit. This is Hackescherhof in Berlin, one of the best tourist spaces in Berlin. People love these intimate, car-free spaces. And that's the feeling you get in these circuitous, let it still move the trucks through, let it still service the market. Don't decrease its capacity to serve the market, although parking trucks may be a different issue. But in terms of bringing goods and services in, you don't have to decrease the capacity. I haven't narrowed these ways at all. I've just shaped them with buildings and moved the parking lot. And then here across from the Ware Center, you take this building edge and the one where I'm standing right now looking at that building edge, and you create a plaza here with just 8 trees or whatever fits, just to celebrate this civic center. And it's also the entryway in here. And I haven't designed it any further than that, but what I didn't draw, because I didn't have the budget, but I'm very excited about, is what these entrances could be like. The idea that you have an archway, that you have amazing, as Charlotte, the city planner, mentioned today, that you have strings of lights overhead, that you have fire pots, with flame in them, and you have market day every day, that you have experiences like this in Denver, the fire, drawing people to the flame. And I was told that elaborate gateways, triumphal arch-like entryways were already proposed for this, and that the local architects killed it because it wasn't of the original character of the market. And I say to hell with that. Because this market could be so much. This market, sorry local architects, I get to leave, it's so great. This market could be so much, and it's really what Lancaster is all about. And Lancaster is this amazing combination of city and country. And there's lots of farmers markets. But how many farmers markets are there surrounded by this, right? And this. And I've been coming here, both to the city and to a local farm now every year for about 5 or 6 years with my family, and my family's been growing in Lancaster, around Lancaster, enjoying this bounty, right? And the animals and the nature and all the things that this market represents. And the curiosity that children have, about how these places work. And this is not unique to Lancaster, but it is more appropriate to have a market with a farm-to-table culture and a city in the country experience for tourists and for people who want to live here, who have the choice to live anywhere, who will choose to live here. And making this market more a central heart of the community can really accomplish that. I mean, look at this. When I first saw this, what I noticed really was just how small the city is compared to other cities that sprawl and sprawl and sprawl, which is a good thing. But of course, what you really notice from this image, what are these? Just farm after farm after farm after farm. And that's what you're about. So why not celebrate it? This combination of nature and culture that everyone wants, and everyone wants both. It's so hard to find both in close proximity, and you have it here. So I really think, all the street changes are really important. It's all very important. But the fun thing, the exciting thing for me is what this market hall can be. So that's the summary. You can see we've gone through now each of these categories. You are now an expert. You should read the report, but you actually don't need to read the report. Here it is. And I was reminded this is the first time I've ever put pictures of my family in a show. And I don't do it because there's always the planner. You go to a planning conference and there's always the planner who ends his show by saying, if you're wondering why I do this, these are my kids and they're going to inherit this planet that we leave behind. I just say, I don't think that's BS. But actually, I don't do this for my kids. This is keeping me away from my kids. This is a problem. I do it for Chuck. This is why we're doing this. And so we want to make Lancaster as great as it can be, but in the short term, we want to make it as safe as we can be. And you've got the three categories of useful, comfortable, and interesting pretty well covered. This is the most beautiful place I've ever done one of these studies. But your streets are bad, and you need to fix them. So thank you, and I appreciate it. And because that was 2 hours, I'm not doing Q&A. However, the city will have a portal open. We'll arrange for the city to have a portal open for responses to the report. The report will be completed within a couple weeks, and then it will be a public document that you can all access on the city's website. So thanks again, and thank you all for your help.
Thank you very much for all the work you've done. When the recent governor took office, somebody asked me if I was interested in working in Harrisburg, and I told them for 42 years I've been walking to work and meeting my wife for lunch, and walking to Harrisburg and back every day would be a lot. But coming home for lunch would be even worse. You've given us a whole lot to think about, some great ideas, some really interesting ideas. Now it's up to us. As Jeff said, when the report's prepared, I've read a rough of it, and when it's prepared and finalized, which I guess will be in the next 3-4 weeks or something, we'll put it on the website. We'll make sure it's available. I don't know if we'll be printing copies of it. We might look at doing that too for those of you who are in the paper. And what we'll have to do really is develop a strategy and a set of priorities about what we want to do first out of this and how we can best use this important information. Again, thank you to our funders. This is really giving us a shot to look forward to the Economic Development Plan, which again, March 19th at McCaskey, they'll be having a meeting on that similar to this. And we're beginning to really lay out the future of Lancaster with this type of thing. So again, thanks a lot. You'll always be welcome back. And frankly, I think he probably knows Lancaster and its streets better than anybody else in the room right now. But again, you'll always be welcome, and thanks for what you've done.